Sharon Hayes' book touches on nearly every single issue that we've discussed in this class. From a critical constructionist perspective, which I outlined in our first unit, we can see how society has constructed poverty in different ways at different times. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, poverty was seen as a tragedy that befell women whose husbands had either died or abandoned them. By the 1980s, poverty was seen as a product of poor choices made by women who had neither a work ethic or family values. So the emphasis of TANF is to promote personal responsibility and family values among wayward women. In a sense, welfare reform took a very unsociological perspective. Rather than examine the structural conditions giving rise to poverty, welfare reform focused on personal choices to explain poverty. The reform never looks at or attempts to fix problems in the larger economy. Instead, it tries to change women. Those wayward women so in need of change are overwhelmingly depicted as black. Although black women represent only 38% of welfare recipients, between 1988 and 1994, 65% of network TV stories about welfare featured black women. And as Hayes notes on page 23, when Ronald Reagan immortalized the image of a Cadillac-driving welfare queen, it was not by chance that the story of fraud he chose to grossly exaggerate was a story of a black woman. The issue of welfare also illuminates the problems of poverty in the family, which we discussed extensively this semester. To the architects of welfare reform, the dramatic rise of single parenting is the cause of poverty and welfare dependency. But as Hayes contends, saying that single parenting is linked to poverty is not the same thing as saying that single parenting causes poverty. Undoubtedly, single-parent households are more likely to be poor, but single parenthood is as much a consequence of poverty as it is a cause. Both single parenthood and poverty are related to structural changes in the economy since the 1970s. These changes, again, led to a decline in men's wages. They also led to a rise in women's labor force participation, which was meant to offset the decline in men's wages. According to Hayes, these changes have destabilized family life. Dual-earner households are more likely to experience work-family conflict and marital stress, leading to an increase in divorce. Men's falling wages make them hesitant to commit to families for fear that they might not be able to financially provide for them. Finally, the rise in women's paid work has enabled them to leave abusive husbands or loveless marriages. These trends are applicable to all Americans, not just welfare families. The problem is that when poor families dissolve, poor women and children are vulnerable to falling into desperate circumstances and turn to welfare as a result. Finally, the case of welfare highlights issues of crime and deviance. To Hayes, welfare mothers are constructed as being deviant, even criminal, by the media. But the majority shares mainstream cultural values. They simply fell into hard times, experienced some catastrophe, or are the 10 to 20% of welfare mothers who suffer debilitating mental illness. As Hayes argues on page 215, poor mothers' support for welfare reform is the single most striking indication that welfare mothers are not the social outsiders portrayed in the Personal Responsibility Act. Most welfare mothers share the core values of most Americans. Hayes estimates that a minority of welfare mothers, anywhere from 25 to 33%, are what we would call deviant. These are people who find themselves in what scholars call a culture of poverty. By this, we mean that families and communities that have experienced poverty over multiple generations develop values and behaviors that reproduce that poverty and that are otherwise in opposition to mainstream cultural values. But as Hayes points out on page 181, it is virtually impossible to conclusively determine whether it's bad values or bad conditions that cause poverty. In either case, these are a minority of cases, a point that Hayes goes to great lengths to show. Regardless of the problems associated with welfare reform, the 1996 Reform Act is largely seen as a success by politicians, caseworkers, and even welfare clients. They point to the decline in welfare rolls as the primary indicator of welfare reform's success. In 1996, at the start of the program, there were over 12 million women and children on welfare. In 2001, there were a little over 5 million. Sharon Hayes finds less reason to be optimistic about these numbers. In general, Hayes estimates that about 1/3, roughly 33% of all welfare mothers will move out of poverty and never return to a welfare office. By far the minority. Another 1/3, or another 33%, will find jobs, but not jobs that will lift them out of poverty. And a final 1/3, or again 33%, will find work, but their low skills and family problems will push them back into the welfare office. The average job held by a former welfare recipient pays $7 an hour, lacks health insurance and sick leave, and is part-time. This helps explain why even the success stories of welfare reform are likely to find their way back onto welfare at some point in their lives. For that 1/3 that's able to escape poverty and the welfare office, it's likely that they would have done so before welfare reform. In fact, Sharon Hayes estimates that only about 10 to 15% of welfare mothers are in a better position now than they would have been had welfare reform never happened. In the long run, she argues, the majority of welfare recipients will be worse off than they would have been had the Reform Act never been passed. In the end, welfare reform doesn't fix the structural problems in the U.S. economy. These are the structural problems that push women into poverty. Instead, it focuses on fixing women who are not in need of fixing. As Hayes explains on page 137, if we approach these social problems only by attempting to fix all the individual women currently on welfare, our efforts will fail. The social system that created their plight will simply spawn a whole new generation to take their place. Moreover, and as Hayes argues, the savings associated with welfare reform will more than be offset by the expenses associated with this reform. As women and children are pushed off the welfare rolls, a larger number of children will wind up in the foster care system, and a larger number of women and children will find their way into crime. Before 1996, the average welfare recipient received $1,680 in cash and services annually. The annual cost of keeping one child in foster care is $6,000, and the annual cost of keeping one person in prison was over $20,000. Indeed, it's less expensive to pay a poor woman to stay at home and raise her children than it is to subsidize the cost of having someone else care for their children so that she can work for low wages. And this is probably the biggest contradiction of welfare reform. The work plan promotes individualism and women's paid work. The family plan promotes family and women's unpaid caregiving. Welfare reform leaves welfare mothers and the rest of us to wonder, what's more important for our society, individual productivity or the bond between parent and child? Thank you.